So, who is Jesus, and is Jesus really any different than other great religious leaders? Pluralistic views about Jesus are very popular today, and pluralistic perspectives would basically be views that would say um, Jesus is really no different than other great religious leaders like Gautama the Buddha or Mahatma Gandhi, the Dalai Lama today, perhaps, Mohammed, Guru Nanak, or Swami Vivekananda. These are all major religious leaders from different religions. And a pluralistic perspective would say, sure, they're different. Jesus was in the Middle East, Gandhi was in India, and so on. But once you get beyond those surface differences, they're really all saying pretty much the same thing. And it really doesn't matter who, if any of those, one chooses to follow. I don't think that perspective is really fair to any of the religions, and it certainly is not fair to Christianity. And when we think about these kinds of issues, I think we want to be especially careful to take what the religions say on their own terms and how believers within the religions understand the teachings and the practices, and not impose upon them views from the outside. And so, for example, I lived many years in Japan. And although pluralistic perspectives are popular in Japan, most Buddhists aren't flattered when they're told, well, Jesus and Gautama the Buddha are basically the same thing. They're just two different sides of the same coin. A good committed Buddhist is going to say, no, they're not. What the Buddha taught is correct. And so that brings us back to this question of Jesus. How is Jesus similar to or different from other great religious leaders? Let me just make one other introductory comment here. I really find it interesting that so many major religions and minor traditions too, the new religious movements in the 20th and 21st centuries, have found it necessary to somehow bring Jesus into their own system. And so Hindus, for example, will talk about Jesus as an avatar or a guru. Buddhists will talk about Jesus as an enlightened bodhisattva. Not quite as good as a Buddha, but an enlightened bodhisattva. And of course, in Islam, Jesus is a prophet. You don't find other religions feeling the necessity to do this with other religious leaders like Zoroaster or Muhammad or Joseph Smith and so on. So there seems to be something really distinctive about Jesus that people find attractive, and somehow they want to make him their own. Well, how are Jesus and other leaders different? We could talk about similarities. There certainly are similarities in teachings and in some actions, but the differences are far greater and starker than the similarities, and that's where I'm going to focus here today. In doing this, I'm going to be looking at Gautama the Buddha and Buddhist teachings and history. And I do this primarily because usually Jesus is equated with Gautama. When people want to say they're all the same, it's usually Jesus and Gautama that are highlighted as being the exemplars of this. So let's look at it a little more carefully. The first point I'd make is simply the relation between Jesus and history is different from the relation between Gautama the Buddha and history in Buddhism. And we could get into this in different ways. I will talk here about the chronology. For example, take Gautama and Buddhism. Historians are not even agreed on the century in which Gautama died. Many say he died in 480 BC. Chinese and Japanese scholars tend to go with the date 386 BC. So there's a whole 100 years difference in trying to pinpoint the century in which he lived. Now, the first Buddhist scriptures were written roughly in the mid-1st century BC, roughly 50 BC, in the island of Sri Lanka, what we call Sri Lanka today. And so that gives you a gap of 300 to 400 years between the death of Gautama and the first written texts in Buddhism, depending on which death date you go with. Now, these early writings were not dealing with teaching so much as how to live in a monastic community. The teachings of Gautama come even a century later. And so you have a large gap between his death and the early writings. His teachings were transmitted orally, but this is a significant gap. Now, in the case of Jesus, he was crucified either in the year 30 or the year 33 AD. And the earliest New Testament texts were written right around the year 50, possibly 49, but the year 50 is pretty safe. 1 Thessalonians, for example. So, in the case of Jesus, we have a gap of 17 to 20 years between his death and the first writings. And another major difference here would be the sheer volume of manuscripts we have available from the early centuries, either portions of the New Testament or later the entire New Testament itself. So the manuscript evidence available for reconstructing the life of Jesus is simply far, far greater than what we have in the case of Gautama the Buddha. A second difference. It's clear to anyone who reads scripture, and Jesus being a first century Jew, this will only make sense. Jesus believed in a creator God. Jesus locates himself within the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, and the teachings of the Old Testament about Yahweh, the one eternal creator God. Buddhists historically have denied the existence of a creator. This is one thing that separated the Buddhists from the early Hindu community. In the modern era, it's become more common for Buddhists, both in Asia and in Europe and North America, to say, well, Buddhism is not atheistic, it just doesn't pronounce one way or another whether there is a God. This is a very modern revisionist view of Buddhism. Historically, it's very clear they reject the idea of an eternal creator. Buddhism has taught that that's an incoherent concept. A third difference. For Jesus, the root problem confronting humankind is sin. Again, this is rooted in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. It is sin against God that has separated us from God. For Buddhism, the root problem is ignorance. Buddhism does talk about moral evil, wrongdoing, but the root problem which is driving suffering and pain and rebirth is ignorance about our true state, our true identity, and clinging to false views about the nature of the self and the soul. So, what is the root problem? Is it sin or is it ignorance? Here's another difference. The New Testament claims that the one eternal creator became incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth. John chapter 1, Colossians 1, Hebrews 1, and so on. Jesus Christ is not simply any other human religious teacher or moral ethical teacher. In a really radical, astounding sense, the one eternal creator takes upon himself human nature, becomes part of the created order in the incarnation. And you simply don't have that in the teachings of Buddhism. Number 5, whereas Gautama presents teachings and practices leading to enlightenment, the New Testament does not present Jesus as merely teaching the way to reconciliation with God. Again, as we just mentioned, the New Testament presents Jesus as himself the way to salvation. So here's a difference. Buddhists claim that Gautama attained enlightenment, and in his enlightenment, he uncovers the truths to what is driving pain, suffering, and rebirth. And if we follow the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, then we too can discover the way to eliminate this causal chain of suffering. He doesn't himself make claims about being the one eternal creator God. Again, Early classical Buddhism denied the reality of an eternal creator God. In the New Testament, by contrast, you don't have Jesus simply saying, I have discovered the way to be reconciled to God. If you follow my teachings, if you do what I do, then you too can be reconciled to God. The claims are much stronger than that. And of course, John 14:6 is the text that most readily comes to mind here, where Jesus declares, I am the way and the truth and the life. And it's a brilliant summation of the teachings of the Gospel of John and the New Testament. It's not just that Jesus discovered the truth about reconciliation to God. It's the entire package, who Jesus is, the pre-existent Logos, the incarnate Word, his sinless life, his teachings, his death on the cross, his resurrection, all of that taken together as a package enables him to make the declaration, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So another way to think about this is, it didn't have to be Gautama Siddhartha in the 6th or 5th century BC who attained enlightenment. It could have been any other ascetic in the Indian subcontinent. And in fact, Buddhists claim that there were many Buddhas before Gautama, and in many other universes around us today, there are other Buddhas. It didn't have to be Gautama who attained that enlightenment. It didn't have to be Muhammad who received, supposedly, the Quran dictated by the angel Gabriel. It could have been anybody else in that first, in the 6th century, 7th century Arabian desert. You can't say the same thing about Jesus. It had to be the pre-incarnate Logos, the incarnate Word, who took our place on the cross and was raised to life again. You cannot separate the teachings from the person of Christ. Finally, a last difference I would point to is simply the resurrection. All great religious leaders die. There is no historically reliable record of any of them coming back to life again, apart from Jesus of Nazareth. If we had more time, we could explore this, but 1 Corinthians 15, for example, lays out what is at stake in the whole debate over the resurrection. If Christ was not raised from the dead, then the game is up. We are still in our sins. We have made God a liar. We, of all people, are most to be pitied. And of course, Paul goes on to say in 1 Corinthians 15, but Christ was raised from the dead. And he famously appeals there to the appearances of Christ. There are at least 4 significant independent factors that together reinforce or support the claims about the resurrection. First, there simply was inadequate time for legends about the resurrection to develop. We can trace the reports of the resurrection back to about 36 AD, comparing 1 Corinthians 15, for example, with Paul's letter to the Galatians and his visit to Jerusalem. Acts chapters 1 and 2, we have the disciples in the very streets of Jerusalem, the very city in which Christ was taken and crucified, just a matter of weeks after the crucifixion, proclaiming that he had been raised from the dead. We also have multiple reports of the appearances of Jesus, not just 1 or 2 private appearances, multiple reports. And again, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 appeals to the public nature of these appearances. Finally, we have the empty tomb. The only counter-narrative we have in the New Testament to the resurrection is the report about the soldiers, the disciples coming and taking the body and the soldiers being paid off to spread that report. That report assumes that the tomb was empty. You wouldn't spread that kind of a report if, in fact, you still had the corpse of Jesus. And then finally, the transformation of the disciples. These 4 factors together present a powerful, cumulative case for the reality of the resurrection. You simply don't have that with other religious leaders. So there's much to admire in other religious leaders. I myself have spent my career studying Buddhism and Gautama. There's much to admire in the person of Gautama, assuming that the stories about his life and early childhood and so on are true. Nevertheless, it's not fair to the Buddhists and it's not fair to the Christians to say Gautama the Buddha and Jesus are simply two sides of the same coin. They're basically saying the same thing. They're not. And it's important to keep those differences in mind.